Picture a medieval courtroom. A woman stands trembling before her accusers, not for theft, not for murder, but for witchcraft. Her crime: allegedly stealing men's private parts, keeping them as pets in a bird's nest, and feeding them oats and corn. Across town, a pig is on trial for fornication with its owner, both man and animal facing the same sentence: death by fire. Meanwhile, in a local brothel, prostitutes don yellow hoods with bells that announce their presence. Tonight, they prepare for the emperor's arrival, where tradition dictates they must symbolically capture him with golden chains at the city gates. These episodes are not the stuff of parody, they are events preserved in medieval records, accounts that generations of historians either ignored or tried to downplay because they were simply too bizarre. Forget the polite image of knights and ladies, peasants and priests. Sexuality in the Middle Ages was a labyrinth of fear, superstition, hypocrisy, and ritual. Courtrooms became theaters where sex itself was tried as evidence of crime, morality, or even witchcraft. Physicians argued that women needed orgasms to conceive. Lawyers dismissed rape if pregnancy occurred. And the Catholic Church, which claimed dominion over every soul in Christendom, attempted to regulate intimacy down to the smallest gesture of affection. Imagine you are married in 13th century France. You desire closeness with your spouse, but intimacy is not simply private, it is a matter controlled by religious law. The Church enforced a sexual calendar so dense with restrictions that some scholars today literally draw flowcharts to keep track of it. Sundays were off limits, the Lord's Day. Fridays were forbidden, for Christ had died then. Thursdays, too, were banned, in remembrance of the Last Supper. Entire seasons were locked down: Lent, 40 days of abstinence, and Advent, for weeks of preparation for Christ's birth. Add to that dozens of saints' feast days and you begin to see the problem. When medieval scholars tallied it all up, the shocking result emerged: a devout Christian couple might legally make love less than once a week. And when those rare occasions did arrive, the rules for the act itself were suffocating. Only one position was permitted: missionary. Any variation, woman on top, intercourse in the manner of dogs, or any position impeding conception, was condemned as sodomy, punishable with years of penance. Even the spirit in which the act was done was policed. Excessive passion, making noise, lingering embraces, these too were sins. A French bishop warned couples against excessive affection, prescribing penance for lingering touches or signs of enjoyment. The ideal Christian union, according to these manuals, should be silent, brief, performed out of duty, and, this is an actual phrase, without pleasure. But if these rules sound impossibly harsh, that was precisely the point. They placed human desire in permanent tension with divine law, guaranteeing that every believer lived with a burden of guilt and thus remained dependent on the sacraments of the Church. Yet behind the facade of piety, hypocrisy thrived. Priests who thundered from the pulpit about lust were themselves frequent customers of the very brothels they condemned. The institution adapted not by abolishing the practice, but by monetizing it. The Church imposed the collegium, a fornication fee. Priests who kept mistresses or visited prostitutes paid an annual tax, neatly recorded alongside burial fees and tithe payments. In the Diocese of Norwich in 1450, church account books list the collegium directly between entries for baptisms and funerals, as if fornication was simply another sacrament. In some German territories, nearly 1/3 of priests were paying this fee. Monasteries, supposedly bastions of chastity, became breeding grounds of scandal. The case of the nun of Wotton is one of the most horrifying examples. Forced into convent life as a child, she became pregnant by a lay brother. When discovered, the response of her sisters was brutal. They captured her lover and forced her to castrate him with her own hands. According to chronicler Ellard of Rievaulx, a senior nun then shoved the severed organs into the girl's mouth as blood still dripped. And yet, when her pregnancy mysteriously vanished soon after, it was declared a miracle, proof of divine forgiveness. The abbey welcomed her back, not as a sinner, but as one purified by humiliation and violence. The lesson is chilling. To them, this was not cruelty but spiritual purification. The body became both battlefield and sacrifice, its suffering a tool of redemption. These were the lengths to which institutions went in order to maintain control. The deeper we peer into this world, the more contradictions appear. On the one hand, the Church declared sex a necessary evil, tolerated only for procreation within marriage. On the other, it profited from vice, sanctioned rituals drenched in erotic symbolism, and tolerated scandals within its own walls. Medieval sexuality was never truly about morality. It was about power, about institutions seeking to dominate the most intimate corner of human life, the bedroom. This was not simply repression, but a carefully constructed system where guilt ensured obedience, and where even the act of love became another ledger entry in the account books of salvation. And while ordinary people strained against the chains of the system, medicine and law would soon twist desire into even darker shapes. If the Church had bound intimacy in chains of sin and penance, medieval medicine added its own locks, each one built on misunderstanding and superstition. Physicians, drawing from the works of Galen and Aristotle, believed that conception required not only the man's seed but also the woman's. This two-seed theory suggested that both husband and wife had to emit seed in orgasm for pregnancy to occur. It was a mistake, but one with catastrophic consequences. Take William of Conches, tutor to the future Henry II of England. In the 1150s, he wrote confidently that without mutual pleasure and emission from both partners, generation cannot occur. By this logic, if a woman conceived after an assault, the courts reasoned she must have experienced pleasure and consent. The cruelty of this doctrine is staggering. English legal texts in the 13th century stated plainly, if she conceived by rape, the charge must be dropped, for without consent, conception is impossible. Imagine the horror of this system. A victim becomes pregnant not only through violence but then sees her pregnancy twisted into evidence against her. Court records bear grim testimony. In France, in the Holy Roman Empire, across medieval Ireland and England, rape charges dissolved when conception occurred. Lady Isabel Butler in 15th century Ireland was abducted, forced into marriage, and repeatedly violated. When she became pregnant, the courts ruled it could not have been rape. Her attacker remained her husband in the eyes of the law. The same medical establishment prescribed sexual release as therapy. Women were told they suffered from suffocatio matricis, a wandering womb that roamed the body in search of moisture, causing fainting spells, seizures, even madness. The cure. Intercourse for married women, and for widows or the unmarried, manual stimulation administered by midwives or physicians. In effect, the medical profession institutionalized therapeutic orgasms, a practice that lingered into the 19th century and contributed to the eventual invention of the vibrator. Behind the clinical language lay an uncomfortable truth. Women's bodies were reduced to objects of treatment, their desire pathologized, their consent irrelevant. The law, meanwhile, staged public rituals of humiliation when questions of sexual capacity arose. Consider the trial by Congress. When a wife sought annulment on grounds of her husband's impotence, French courts ordered proof. The procedure was grotesquely methodical. The husband's genitals were first examined by matrons who attempted to arouse him. If that failed, the couple was placed in bed under the gaze of witnesses who peeked through curtains, watching for signs of penetration. The pressure destroyed men who might otherwise have been perfectly capable. In 1659, the case of the Marquis de Gesvres scandalized Paris when pamphlets mocked his repeated failures before the matron's eyes. Yet years later, he remarried and fathered children, exposing the absurdity of the system. Not all punishments ended in embarrassment, many ended in mutilation. Adultery was treated as a public crime. In 11th century England under King Nut, a woman found guilty could have her nose and ears cut off. The choice of mutilation was symbolic. The nose was the marker of beauty, its removal a permanent brand of shame. Archaeologists excavating burial grounds have found skeletal remains of women with such injuries, proof that this was no idle threat. Even animals were not spared the courtroom. Bestiality was condemned as the darkest sin, worse than incest, sodomy, or murder. And so both human and beast were prosecuted. A pig accused of coupling with its owner might be dressed in human clothes and hanged or burned alongside him, to mark its corruption. Yet records show strange moments of compassion. In 16th century France, a donkey was acquitted after villagers testified to her virtuous behavior, convincing the court that she had been forced. Meanwhile, her human partner burned. Hundreds of such cases, the archives of France and Germany, revealing a world where justice extended its net into the barnyard, as though animals too bore responsibility for sin. The logic behind these trials seems surreal to us, but to medieval minds it was consistent. If sexuality could summon divine wrath, then every deviation, be it a man's impotence, a woman's adultery, or a pig's violation, threatened the community with spiritual pollution. Punishment had to be visible, dramatic, purifying. The body was theater, its suffering a warning. What emerges is a society obsessed with controlling desire not only through moral codes but through public performance, medicine, and law. Sexuality was turned into evidence, treatment, crime, and spectacle, its power feared as much as it was misunderstood. And yet, these terrors were only the beginning. For as the Middle Ages wore on, fear of desire merged with fear of heresy, witchcraft, and even plague. Sexuality itself would be cast as a demonic conspiracy, and Europe would plunge into centuries of trials, persecutions, and fantasies darker still. By the late Middle Ages, anxieties over sex no longer belonged solely to the church or the courtroom. They bled into every corner of society, entwining with superstition, politics, and fear of disease. Desire became not just a private matter but a public danger, something capable of summoning God's wrath, spreading plague, or undermining entire kingdoms. Homosexuality faced relentless persecution. Venice created special drowning pools where accused men were tied between columns at high tide and left until the sea swallowed them. In Spain, the punishment was fire. But Florence went further, establishing the infamous Office of the Night in 1432, a police force dedicated solely to rooting out same-sex relations. Over 70 years, they investigated more than 17,000 men, nearly half the city's adult male population. Records detail everything: who played the active role, who was passive, where they met, how often. Some paid fines. Others were branded or pilloried. Repeat offenders risked death. The obsession reveals not only fear of desire but a bureaucratic machine that thrived on surveillance and denunciation. During crises, scapegoats multiplied. When the Black Death devastated Europe in the 1340s, terrified communities looked for culprits. In Bruges, Jean Vanderden was burned at the stake because officials claimed his unnatural lust had poisoned the air and unleashed the plague. Similar executions erupted across the continent. Sexual sinners, it was believed, had invited divine punishment upon entire cities. Even the powerful were not safe. In 1307, King Philip IV of France sought to destroy the Knights Templar and seize their wealth. His weapon was sex. The Templars, once the most prestigious military order of Christendom, were accused of obscene rituals, initiates forced to kiss their master's anus, engage in homosexual orgies, and spit on the cross. Most of these charges were fabrications wrung from tortured confessions, yet they worked because medieval Europe was primed to see heresy and sexual deviance as inseparable. Within years, the order was extinguished, its leaders burned, its treasures absorbed by the crown. By the 15th century, this paranoia found its most grotesque expression in the Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting manual of 1487. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, were obsessed with sex in ways that revealed more about their own fears than any supposed witches. They insisted that witches could steal men's penises through sorcery, collecting dozens at a time in birds' nests where they twitched and writhed like worms, feeding on grain. Chroniclers recorded stories of men climbing trees to retrieve their stolen members, only to be told that the largest one belonged to the parish priest. These tales were not satire. Learned inquisitors believed them. Women were tortured into confessing such crimes and executed for them. In Tuscan murals, witches were depicted plucking penises from trees like fruit, calm as harvesters in an orchard. It is tempting to dismiss chastity belts or the Lord's right to sleep with a bride on her wedding night as part of this madness, but those were myths, later inventions or Renaissance jokes. The truth was stranger. Cities across Europe operated municipal brothels, often under church oversight. In London, they were known as the Bishop of Winchester's geese, because the bishop licensed and taxed them. Prostitutes were made to wear uniforms, yellow hoods with bells in Leipzig, black cloaks with stripes in Milan. In Nuremberg, regulations banned married men from visiting on Sundays, while Jewish clients had to pay double. Rituals could even turn prostitution into pageantry. In 1471, when Emperor Frederick III entered Nuremberg, sex workers captured him at the gates with golden chains and demanded ransom before releasing him. A civic ceremony half farce, half festivity. This uneasy balance, sin taxed, vice regulated, collapsed in 1494 when a new and terrifying disease appeared. Syphilis swept through Europe with speed unmatched, spreading from Naples to Scotland in 2 years. Flesh rotted from the face, sores bloomed across bodies, entire armies were crippled. Suddenly, the pragmatic medieval system of managed vice was untenable. Brothels shuttered overnight. Prostitutes were imprisoned in pest houses. Engagements were broken when grooms showed lesions. Sex itself seemed lethal, and centuries of compromise crumbled in panic. And yet, beneath the horrors, one truth emerges. The medieval world knew that desire could never be extinguished. Every bizarre law, every grotesque punishment, every public spectacle was an attempt to impose order on something unruly and eternal. People sinned, priests paid their brothel taxes, kings fell to scandal, and ordinary couples navigated impossible calendars just to touch one another. What survives today are the records, mutilated skeletons, court transcripts of animal trials, penitential manuals cataloging forbidden positions, even manuscripts adorned with obscene doodles of penis trees. They are fragments of a world that seems alien, yet deeply human. For all its fear, its cruelty, its superstition, medieval sexuality reminds us of the same struggle that defines us now. The tension between desire and control, between the human body and the systems that seek to govern it. That tension created spectacles so shocking historians ignored them for centuries. But they are real, written into law, painted into manuscripts, etched into bones. They are the monuments of a civilization both stranger and more familiar than we imagine. If this glimpse into history's darkest corners intrigued you, hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next untold story.